welcome to Addicted to Murder. This is Courtney, licensed professional counselor with over 10 years of experience.
And this is Trisha, and I'm really excited to get on the open Corniche next week.
What is a Corniche?
It's a seaside road.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to the coast next weekend with a couple of gal pals, so I'm excited.
That does sound fun. I love driving on the coast.
I mean, until it gets super windy. Those of you who don't live in Oregon, it's some very windy, cliffy coast.
I don't mind that.
Oh. I mean, I like looking, but I'm not the... I tend to gaze at the ocean, and I kind of steer that way, so I'm a little bit scary.
That makes sense. Maybe you shouldn't drive.
I'm hoping not to, but I'm assuming I will. So anyways, welcome to Addicted to Murder. And we are going to put the social media at the end today.
Because I think that makes sense.
Give it a whirl that way.
Yes.
So
not bog down our opening quite so much.
Right. So I guess we can just say we finished up Bob Hansen, a.k.a. the Butcher Baker, last week.
Yes, we did.
And he was just a two-parter because, as Courtney kind of pointed out at the end, he just didn't turn out to be all that interesting.
I know. It was kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
But this guy that we're starting today, he is interesting.
Holy Moses. I'm going to do the question, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we're getting into because it's kind of a big mess.
Sounds good. Shoot away.
So it's my question today, and Courtney, as we look at these serial killers, and some of them do get put on death row, such as Ted Bundy, they had a last meal. What would your last meal be?
Ooh, that is such a hard question because I really like food, just in general, all types of food. I think I might go like breakfast and go with like blueberry pancakes.
That's it? You can have anything you want.
Yeah, blueberry pancakes. Maybe some chocolate milk.
Dang.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Simple, delicious.
Carby.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of on the opposite. I would do garlic bread, Dungeness crab, salad with vinaigrette, and rice seasoned with Johnny's seasoning salt.
That is very specific.
I've thought a lot about it. I really have. I mean, that's kind of weird, but I've actually asked this question at like game night.
Oh,
so
all right.
Okay.
Well, there we go.
Thanks for that answer.
Yeah.
So the case we're covering today, it's going to be kind of a long one. We're doing it all in one. Was suggested to us by a listener in Belgium, and it was a man, and actually he had accomplices that we had never heard of. And it's a really disturbing case because it's involving harming children, killing them, molesting them, etc. So if that is something that might trigger you, just don't listen to this episode. And I also want to note that this episode will illustrate what we know about Marc Dutroux, who they named the Monster of Belgium. But we will also focus a lot on one of his surviving victims who wrote a book about her experiences. And her name is Sabine Dardenne. And apologies ahead of time if we mispronounce any of these names. They're mostly French. And we're doing our best, but I'm sure we'll screw something up. So anyhow, we hope to convey, so what takes place mentally with the victim as a crime such as this, but also what's going on with Marc as much as we can figure it out.
Sounds good. Let's jump in.
Okay. So Marc Dutroux was born November 6th, 1956 in Islies, Belgium, which is like a suburb of the capital, Brussels. So Dutroux is the eldest of 5 children, and both of his parents were teachers who at one point moved to the Congo for about 4 years and then came back to Belgium in 1960. Dutroux reports that he was beaten often by both of his parents, and in 1971, his parents divorced. So Dutroux lived with his mother, who was reported as being very dominating and abusive until the age of 16, where he briefly left and became a male sex worker, serving mostly other males. It's also noted that he was a juvenile delinquent and petty criminal in his youth. So I imagine, based on what comes later, he was a thief as far as the petty criminal. And he probably started that at a pretty young age. So, Courtney, we really don't have much information on Mark's childhood, but from what we've discovered so far, can you tell us anything about what Mark might be going through? Male prostitution at age 16 seems like a very dangerous and thrill-seeking type of behavior. Do you think that's what's going on, or do you think it's purely the need for money?
Well, like you said, a lot of this is going to be speculation. And so we can only speculate on what, being beaten often by his parents really means. But I think it's probably safe to assume that the physical abuse he endured was pretty traumatizing. And he was also the oldest child in his family. And there is some research that suggests that oldest children are often held to higher expectations and are more likely to be physically abused than their younger siblings. I just thought that was sort of interesting, some kind of birth order ideas. And then we also know that youth who've experienced abuse are more likely to engage in illegal behaviors like theft, sex work, substance abuse, that kind of thing, and report increased depression as well. So if we assume that Mark was experiencing, all of these factors, then it's not surprising that he would run away kind of as soon as possible, age 16 in this case, and in terms of the sex work, it's hard to say what role that may have played in his life at the time, knowing what we later found out about, his sexual proclivities. But really, anytime there's a teen engaging in sex work, I think we have to assume, first off, that it was survival sex, doing what he had to do to get by.
Going back a little bit to what you said as the eldest sibling usually getting more of the beating than the younger siblings, do you think also that the elder siblings might put themselves in that situation to protect their younger siblings?
That is absolutely something that happens.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So by age 19, Mark had found and married his first wife, known as Francois D. They had 2 children together. Mark reportedly beat this wife, and he was a philanderer. They divorced in 1983. So during this time that they were married, Mark became an electrician. He was also involved in sex trafficking and car theft. And he was able to make a lot of money in these enterprises and eventually would have 7 properties. He was jailed previously for these crimes in 1979, but it carried a very light sentence for him. Mark eventually married one of his mistresses, and her name is Michelle Martin. She was a primary school teacher who would eventually have 3 children with Mark. And I want you guys just to think of Michelle as like the Ghislaine Maxwell to Jeffrey Epstein. In 1986, Dutroux and Martin were arrested for the heinous crimes of abducting and repeatedly raping 5 young girls. Little girls, not women, but children. For this crime, he was sentenced to 13 and a half years, and she was sentenced to 4. Apparently, she would film him with the children and take photographs, pornography, all that terrible things. Mark would end up only serving 3 years after the 1989 sentencing. So it took 3 years for him to get sentenced. Then he served 3 years after that. And he got out on good behavior. So while in prison this time, he began to form a plan where he would abduct many young girls and try to create an underground network or society. He said it would protect them from the real pedophile sex rings in Belgium, and they would only submit to him. He would be their savior. Apparently, Mark's own mother sent a letter to the parole board advising against getting him paroled early. And I imagine she just knew what type of guy he turned out to be. And this is a quote from Wikipedia. The early release of Dutroux was granted by Melchior Watheret, who was at the time the Belgian Minister of Justice. Dutroux's release was ordered against the advice of both the public prosecutor and the psychiatrist who had examined him in prison, who stated that Dutroux remained dangerous. So, Courtney, let's recap here. Here's a young man who had a criminal childhood that involved sex work, theft, and other minor offenses. He marries a woman who he beats and has children, and then divorce. He marries his mistress, who was said to be aiding him in these child abductions and rapes. He is released 8 years early from prison for the kidnapping and raping charges. His mother warns the court that this is a terrible idea. What kind of person do you think Mark is at this point? Do you believe in his story of abducting young girls so he could keep them safe? Is he delusional, or is he just a liar and a big piece of shit? Also, as Americans, we're used to child abusers having a lot more jail time for the type of crimes he committed, and these men are usually not safe in prison. Do you have any insight on how the Belgian prison system may differ from our own?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. So his pattern of criminal behaviors starting so young, could be indicative of conduct disorder, which we've talked about before, that evolved into antisocial personality disorder in young adulthood. So just a quick review, a person with antisocial personality disorder is likely to engage in criminal behaviors without remorse or fear of consequences. They lack empathy for others and may engage in cruel or abusive behaviors towards others. And they easily lie or manipulate others to get what they want, all the while frequently engaging in risk-taking behaviors. And so these behaviors are habitual and generally do not respond to interventions, i.e. they don't get better. So even at this young age in his early 20s, it seems pretty clear that Marc meets this criteria. And I mean, even his mother recognized it in him, that there was something not right. That all being said, I think that Marc's explanation about wanting to save these young girls from pedophile rings is complete bullshit. He would have had no real empathy for sex trafficking victims and no motivation at all to want to help them. I mean, he's literally a sex offender himself. And then, as for the jails, I don't know much about the differences between Belgian and U.S. prisons, so listeners feel free to correct anything that I might get wrong here. What I do know is that, in general, many European prison systems have shorter sentences for most crimes than here in the U.S. And I also read that around the time of Marc's first release from prison, Belgium was facing severe overcrowding in their prisons, which was listed as one of the factors for his release. And not to mention that all of this occurred in the 1980s, and across the board, sex crimes and child abuse were not taken as seriously by law enforcement as they would be today.
It's unfortunate. Mm-hmm. Well, this is messed up. So upon release, Dutroux obtained a registration as an invalid. So he claimed that in prison he got sick, and he was able to get compensation for this from the government to the tune of 800 euros a month. I tried to Google, what that was back then and compared to the minimum wage that Belgian citizens got, but I couldn't figure it out. But it sounds like a fairly large amount of money to me. I don't know. Also, he claimed that he could not sleep, so he was also given sedatives and sleeping aids that he would use later in crimes against children. When he was released, he primarily lived in his house in Marcinelle. He built a hidden room that was 7 foot long, 3 feet wide, and 5 feet high. So this would be used as his torture chamber / dungeon for the girls he was going to abduct. So I'm just picturing in my mind, that's not a very big space at all.
No, it's not.
That's spreading, not even spreading your arms out and, about my dad tall with another foot.
Yeah, it's kind of like a bathroom.
If
the
yeah.
size of a small bathroom.
Yeah, that's terrible. In June of 1995, Dutroux kidnapped 2 8-year-old girls. Their names were Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau. Sorry if I said those names wrong. They were abducted while they were on a walk by Dutroux and or his accomplices. Both of these little girls were forced to live in that tiny dungeon. They were repeatedly abused and had pornographic pictures and videos taken of them. Some accounts say it was Marc's wife, Michelle, who took these pictures and pornographic videos. Per the documentary Courtney and I watched, these 2 young girls were too young to endure the abuse that Dutroux wanted to commit. Their bodies were just too small, too fragile. So we decided to kidnap a couple of other girls who were older. So they were 17-year-old Anne Michel and Machal, and 19-year-old Effie Lambrex. These 2 were on a camping trip in Ostend. It is thought that these 2 were abducted by Dutroux and his drug-addicted accomplice, Michel, a different Michel, it's a guy, I'm sorry. Dutroux would reimburse Lelevre with drugs for his help. These two new girls were at first kept upstairs, chained to walls, but eventually taken to another one of his properties. So at this point, he has very young girls in one house, in that little tiny 7 by 3 room, and then two older teen girls that he is also raping on a regular basis at a different house, chained to walls up in the bedroom. Well, okay, so it turns out that these older girls were just too much trouble for Dutroux. They were able to fight back harder. They made multiple escape attempts, and it was just too much. Dutroux decided they had to go. So allegedly, he used some of the drugs he was given by the government, and it made them fall asleep. He then buried them alive in his property's backyard. Alive. Courtney, I don't know about you, but that is one of the most horrifying things I can think of. What do you think about this grotesque excuse for a human being now?
Well, Marc Dutroux really is a despicable example of a person, for sure. And, I consider myself a sometimes excessively compassionate person, but I have a very, very hard time finding any empathy or understanding for adults who harm children. It's really hard for me. And at this point, I feel pretty confident in labeling him as a psychopath with sadistic tendencies. We haven't really talked about sexual sadism much with the past few killers that we've talked about, so just to kind of refresh everyone's memory, a sexual sadist is a person who derives pleasure, or arousal, and sexual gratification from inflicting or watching the pain and suffering of others. And, in the criminal justice system and in forensic psychology, these are the worst of the worst offenders. And Marc definitely fits the bill.
Okay, sorry for that. So in late 1995, Dutroux was being held in jail for possible involvement in stolen luxury cars. So at this point, he gets arrested while those two little girls are still housed. Okay. So please note, sometime prior to this incarceration, it was rumored that Dutroux killed one of his criminal accomplices by drugging him, torturing him, and then by doing something with his testicles, and then burying him alive at one of his properties. So this man I speak of was involved with this luxury car theft, so I'm just bringing that up. Okay, so at this point, he still has the two little girls captive in the dungeon in his main residence. He has already disposed of the two older girls. While he was incarcerated, he asked his wife, Michelle, to be sure to feed the two 8-year-olds, as well as his dog. Apparently, Michelle was too, quote, scared to go into the dungeon to feed the little girls, so they unfortunately starved to death in that tiny hole in the basement. A tiny hole with no natural light, no real airflow, no plumbing. I can't imagine how terrible and terrifying and desperate it was for these little girls, and my morbid mind did bring up the question, what did the surviving one go through before she died watching her friend die first? I can't even, go there. I kind of did. But Courtney, what the heck is going on with his wife? She claims she couldn't handle going down there to feed them, but she has children of her own. Doesn't she have, any sympathy for these kids? She was a primary school teacher, for gosh sakes. What was the term that they threw out in that documentary? I couldn't remember it. The one about the couple sort of sharing the same mindset, her and Dutroux.
Yeah, so the documentary we watched suggested that Marc and Michelle may have been suffering from what's called a folie à deux, or loosely translated to madness of two. So the more clinical term for it would be a shared delusional disorder, where two people or more develop and hold on to the same delusional belief about something. I personally don't think that this fully applies in this case, because I believe that Marc knew exactly what he was doing and just didn't care that it was wrong or terrible. So I don't think he was delusional at all. I do think it's possible, however, that Marc convinced Michelle to go along with it, likely through the use of physical and mental abuse. I mean, he abused his previous wife. There's no reason why he wouldn't be abusing this one, even though it wasn't ever, mentioned specifically. And I mean, she reported being afraid of going down to check on the girls, which may have been a conditioned response. For example, Marc could have threatened to beat her severely or harm their own children if she ever went into his dungeon, without him, for example. And also, when a person is exposed to this kind of horror, even just knowing what was happening or being forced to participate in it, it's sometimes essential for them to kind of completely dissociate emotionally from what's happening in order to cope and survive through it.
I never thought about her being conditioned not to go to the basement. Kind of reminds me of Jerry Brutos's wife.
Right, exactly.
Like, she wanted to go down there at first, but then he kind of made it, like, threatened her enough to where she's just like, yeah.
Right, like maybe, like, 'cause she was, the one who reportedly was taking pictures and things like that. But that, again, also may have been forced. We don't really know much about her.
Okay. So after Dutroux was released from prison 3 months later, he had no victims because he had killed the first two, or the elder two, and then the two little girls died while he was in prison. So he sort of did a Goldilocks and Three Bears type of thing. So his first victims were too young to torture how he wanted to. His second set of victims were too old. They were too crafty and they fought back. So now he decided to get victims who were in between. So he then kidnapped 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne while she was riding her bike to school. Now, Sabine was the one that wrote a book that I was talking about at the beginning, and it was about her experience with this monster. So we're going to shift a little bit from Marc Dutroux to Sabine's experience. Please also note that her book, called I Choose to Live, is a fascinating and heartbreaking tale, but I highly recommend it. So this is a quote from Sabine's book on how she was abducted. I just had time to sense it coming up behind me, but saw it properly only when right beside me. The side door slid open, and a man was leaning out, while another man was doing the driving. I didn't understand exactly what was happening because instinctively at this point I closed my eyes, even before I felt afraid. It felt as if I'd been grabbed from my bike, and the next second I was literally swinging in midair with one hand round my mouth and another covering my eyes. For a split second, my foot got stuck under the saddle, but then came free, leaving my bike careering on down the road on its own. In a flash, I'd been thrown inside, and my satchel wrenched off my back. So I'm assuming she wrote her book in French, and it was translated to English. So some of these words we don't really use in America, but I think the saddle was the bike seat.
That's what I assumed.
So anyhow, some of this stuff sounds kind of odd. It's just, most likely, it's just because it's not an American written book. So Courtney, this seems like a pretty ballsy abduction. I mean, it was broad daylight, literally snatching a little girl off her bike while she's in motion. I kind of think of Harvey Kerrigan murdering that woman in a public park at dusk.
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely brazen. I mean, I would guess that Marc was probably feeling pretty invincible, given the fact that the police had literally searched his house when he was in jail, when he was holding those two 8-year-olds captive, and they didn't find them, and he got away with it.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. There were actually more than one time that the police searched his house, but this little dungeon he had was so cleverly disguised, and it was kind of encased by a thick wall. Also, he sort of brainwashed his captives to not make any noise if someone came, which we'll see later.
Right. So, I mean, if you could get away with that, then of course you can get away with kidnapping a girl in broad daylight.
Mm-hmm. It's that narcissism immunity?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Later, Sabine found out that these two had been stalking her for a week. Once she was in the van, yes, of course, it was a scary van, and her screaming and fighting proved pointless, Dutroux tried to force her to take several of the pills, which she was mostly able to spit out. So these are the pills the government gave him. Eventually, they stopped the car and forced her to get into a box that she described no bigger than a toolbox. They basically had to fold her up to get her in and shut the box. They then drove to another location where they had to unfold her to get her out of the box. At this point, the driver had gone, and it was just little Sabine and Dutroux. He took her into the house and up the stairs, where he forced her to remove her clothes and then to put a chain around her neck that was just long enough to get to the chamber pot about 3 feet away. Dutroux kept visiting Sabine and telling her stories as to why she was captured. He told her that his boss wanted her kidnapped because her father, who had been a policeman, had done a bad thing, and her abduction was vengeance. The boss would demand a €3 million ransom, which Sabine said there's no way her parents could have paid that. On the second day of her capture, Dutroux started to do things with Sabine. She does not go into detail, but he was abusing her at this point. Dutroux also began to brainwash Sabine into believing that her parents refused the ransom and therefore the boss wanted Sabine killed. Dutroux informed Sabine that he would be her savior and keep her alive against the boss's wishes. But if she were to call or try to leave or anything, the boss would know and kill her immediately. Dutroux then offered Sabine a choice. Do you want to live or die? Sabine's answer was to live, and so Dutroux informed her. This is a quote. Okay, but then I'll have to hide you. I'll say that you're dead, but you'll still be alive, and I'll look after you. Obviously, I can't leave you here in this room because the boss would see you. These are his headquarters, you see, so he could turn up here at any moment. And if you had any idea about running away, well, he'd get you back just in order to kill you. A matter of honor. All the houses around here are under his command, so it's a bit of a tricky one. But I know a secret place where I could hide you. Courtney, can you tell us a little bit about brainwashing, how common it is? Is it easier to do in younger individuals? Are you having any new thoughts on Marc Dutroux's mental state as we learn firsthand what he would do to his victims?
Yeah, so I think brainwashing is actually far more common than we like to think. And really, we're all sort of exposed to attempts at minor brainwashing every day through media, societal pressures, politics, etc. However, the specific coercive control that Marc used is more often associated with things like kidnapping victims, cults, and domestic abuse situations. And typically, it follows a pattern that starts with isolation. So separate them from everyone that they knew who might be able to give them different information. Then breaking down that person's belief or sense of self, then offering a kind of salvation, and then rebuilding the self as the leader wants it to be. So with Sabine, what we see is, he isolated her by kidnapping her and locking her in a dungeon, told her that she was not safe outside and that her parents didn't care about her, tried to convince her that he was the only person who could keep her safe, and then introduced her to the new normal of what her day-to-day life would become. And so this type of blatant manipulation and lying just keeps giving credence to Marc Dutroux's status as a psychopath.
So, the elder girls didn't buy his shit because they were older, I'm assuming. And when you're younger, it's just easier to believe what an adult tells you. You just take it as truth.
There is something to that. I think also that the girls were abducted together, so they could play off each other. Probably had some role in that.
Okay. Well, so Sabine was still groggy with fear, lack of sleep, and the drugs he kept giving her, but she eventually was taken down to the secret place, where she would remain for 80 days. That was the tiny room in the cellar, hidden behind a wall that was disgusting and dirty. She describes it multiple times in the book, and it's just absolutely filthy. She became absolutely filthy. There was a nasty mattress that she said smelled like pee, a place for her chamber pot, and a TV that would only play Sega games. Throughout her book, she, would talk about all the bugs that were down there, the terrible smells, the way her nose would constantly be plugged because she was now always sick. There was a tiny, inefficient ventilator he had rigged from a computer fan and light. He supplied her with a little milk, a little tap water, and bread. Most of the time, the milk was bad and the bread was moldy. Not enough to really feed her, though, as throughout her imprisonment, she was often starved. A pattern began. Sabine would be locked up in that horrible, disgusting place for most of the day, where she only had her school bag and the console to occupy her mind, and the other part of the day, she would be escorted upstairs to have vile things done to her by Dutroux. He provided her with very little in clothing, and she only had the same underwear she was abducted in for all that time. She would wash it whenever she could, but it took 2 days to dry. She was constantly forced to be naked during her imprisonment. He would allow her to bathe once a week, but only if he did it, and he would scrub her until she had welts all over her body. She also said that she had warts, and he was kind of disgusted by the warts, and he would try to scrub them off, and it was terribly painful. Eventually, her captor began to rape her. She would keep track on those days on a calendar she created. Those were the most painful days, and she marked them with 2 X's instead of 1. Courtney, throughout Sabine's book, she describes various coping mechanisms, One of them was to constantly argue and scream at her captor. She absolutely hated him. She said she constantly tried to wear him down and came close on several occasions, she thought, to being killed because he was just so annoyed by her. She asked questions, she pestered him, she demanded things, although she rarely got them. She seems to really have taken a stand in the best way she could. Do you think this is typical behavior? I would think most children, including myself, would cower in this situation.
I think that a lot of that is just Sabine's survival instinct. You know, we all have our natural response to fear, you know, that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And I mean, Sabine was clearly a fighter. And I think the fact that she kept fighting, that gave her also like the will to keep living.
She did say that there was two ways to refer to someone in French, in you, vous, and vous. Mm-hmm. And she refused to use the personal with him. Like, she was doing all sorts of things she could to mentally keep him at arm's length. Mm-hmm. Like, so.
Yeah, which is a remarkably sophisticated strategy for a 12-year-old, especially in the way that would counter his attempts to sort of manipulate and brainwash her into trusting him.
Yeah. So this is an example Sabine gave about the dialogue that was common between them. This is Sabine. This muck is disgusting. Stop whining and just get it down. I want to see my parents. Not possible. I don't want to go upstairs. I don't like it. Tough shit. So she said that she was just constantly talking back, and which I think is awesome. I'm surprised. But you know what? None of us knows what we would do in that situation until we're in that situation.
Exactly.
So one day Sabine told Dutroux that she wanted a friend, and a few days later he told her he had brought back a friend for her. Now, Sabine at this point was like almost mentally broken. She actually thought Dutroux would bring one of her friends to visit her. Remember, she's convinced that she is there because if she were to leave, she would be killed by the boss, and he was saving her and keeping her safe. She did have opportunities to make phone calls or run away, but she truly thought she would be killed. Anyhow, the friend Dutroux brought for her was no one she knew. Here's a quote from her book. I didn't know where she'd come from, and as I still hadn't really worked out that I'd been kidnapped rather than rescued, I had no reason to suspect that she'd been snatched from her family either. I just supposed that he must have gone to see someone he knew and mentioned how he was looking for a friend for this girl who was getting bored with being on her own. This new girl was 14-year-old Letitia Delhez, D-E-L-H-E-Z, who had been walking home from swimming one day when she was abducted. When she saw Letitia, okay, so here, now the quote's over. So when she saw Letitia drugged and chained around her neck, Sabine felt instant panic. She asked herself, what have I done? Knowing that Letitia was abducted because of her. In her book, Sabine's very conflicted. She feels terrible that Letitia was taken like her because of her, but also hopeful because she was not alone. Letitia, when the drugs had worn off, recognized Sabine from the flyers all over Belgium. She told Sabine that her parents were desperate to find her. Sabine replied they must not be that desperate as they refused to pay the ransom. Letitia was taken on August 9th, and fortunately a witness saw her and went to the police. Dutroux was brought in August 13th for questioning. His houses were searched, but nothing was found. The dungeon he created was very well hidden, but 2 days later, Dutroux and his wife confessed, and on August 15th, the girls were found alive. So, Courtney, Sabine says multiple times in her book how much guilt she still carries over Letitia being kidnapped. Her rational mind knows that she was a 12-year-old girl on the brink of mental collapse when she asked for a friend. And she also knows it was Dutroux, not her, responsible for the kidnapping, but she still feels an immense amount of guilt. Is this perhaps like a survivor's guilt, even though both are alive? She reasons with herself that if it hadn't been for Letitia's kidnapping, she may never have been found. Any thoughts you have on this?
This is actually a very common way of thinking and feeling for those who've experienced a kind of shared trauma. You know, there's that guilt about not protecting the other, not preventing the other from being harmed, or feeling as though they've done something to cause harm to the other. I mean, it is unwarranted guilt, as the only person to blame in this situation is Marc Dutroux. but it can be a really hard feeling to let go of.
Now, Sabine wrote this book when she was 20, so she's like, I think in her late 30s now, so I don't know what's happened since then, but she did say she refused to go to therapy. She said that she didn't need it. She could figure this out on her own. I mean, but she was still carrying around this guilt. I would think that therapy could help her at least come to terms with it. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
I think it's very possible. I mean, the kind of trauma that she experienced, there's so much complexity to the thoughts and feelings that go along with that, that I think working with a good therapist could really help her if she ever, felt like she was ready to do that.
Yeah. I mean, the way she described it was that she just didn't want to think about it or talk about it, so she didn't. Right, as much as she could. I mean, because now she was infamous in Belgium. Okay, so the trial was held 7.5 years later. Trial by jury with 450 people who testified. Dutroux was tried for the murder of the two elder victims, Anne Marchal and Effa Lambrechts, and also for his former accomplice. His wife was tried as an accomplice. You can see parts of this trial on YouTube. It's pretty interesting. The system in Belgium is different than the U.S. I mean, I saw more than one judge. The accused were put into what I assume was a bulletproof box in the courtroom to protect them from outsiders. Dutroux claimed he did not kill the 8-year-olds because he was technically in jail at the time that they starved, and his wife was supposed to have fed them. So, the trial took 3 months, and he was found guilty on all charges. Dutroux received life in prison. Belgium does not have the death penalty. Michel Martin received 30 years, and one of his accomplices received 25 years. Michael received 5 years on drug charges because there was not enough to tie him to the kidnapping. Per Murdepedia, Dutroux did not deny abduction of Sabine or locking her away for 80 days in a cell, naked and chained by the neck on a diet of water and tinned food, or raping her repeatedly, but he denied wrongdoing. I'm not a pedophile, even if it's true that I slipped up with Sabine at a time when I was lonely and needed affection. Okay, Courtney, final thoughts, diagnosis, curse words regarding this guy, and let's not forget his wife, the accomplice, who, by the way, was released 14 years early. Remember, she was partially, if not all the way, responsible for the actual deaths of the two 8-year-olds.
So, Marc Dutroux is a sadistic psychopath who does not ever deserve the opportunity to be around other humans ever again. The title of a song I really like by Martha Wainwright comes to mind right now. The title of her song is called Bloody Motherfucking Asshole. And I think that seems to fit for him pretty well. And that about sums him up, As for his wife, yes, she allowed and even participated in some extremely horrific things that deserve punishment. But I don't know enough about her to say for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if she was also one of Marc's victims herself in a certain way. I also was reading that Marc was able to petition for parole in 2021, dependent on a new psychological evaluation. Fortunately, the assessor agreed that he is dangerous and should not be released, and this time the judge actually listened to that advice, and his parole was denied.
I imagine if he would have been released, unless he went into some super secret hiding, he wouldn't be around for very long on the streets.
Oh, there would be chaos, I think, in Belgium from the general public.
We didn't really go into it, but this whole case really shook up Belgium and other parts of Europe. It was a huge thing. The way it was handled from the get-go and, his prior convictions, and then the houses being searched. And Sabine said in her book, one of the officers that had searched the house while they were captive, he couldn't find them, but they ripped him apart on the stand. He was in tears. And she said that she felt no animosity towards him. I mean, they were well hidden. They were conditioned to be quiet and not to cry out.
Right, yeah. And kind of following this case, there were a lot of changes made to kind of like Belgium's investigation and justice system because of how poorly kind of this case was handled.
And you know, the twisted irony of the state paying this guy 800 years a month and giving him drugs that he used on his victims. You know, it's just all crazy. And I guess 1/3 of Belgium's population with the surname Dutroux changed their names after this because they didn't want to have any sort of affiliation with him at all.
Right. Dutroux is or at least was a fairly common last name in Belgium.
Probably in France too. I mean, it sounds French to me, but you know, that's just my American ears. I don't really know if it is.
Yeah. Well, I believe they speak French in Belgium.
There's 3 languages. Remember, I can't remember now, but the gal that suggested this
that's right.
responded to at the very beginning of this, we used to shout out to every country, but then now there's just too many of you guys listening to us. So yeah, there's French, my God, I can't even remember. I'd have to go look, but there's 3. So anyhow, so that is the terrible case, and we really didn't touch on it too much. I mean, we could have gone really deep and really dark, but we didn't. I do suggest anyone to read this gal's book. It's, you know, it's not full of horrific details, but her, like, throughout the whole time she was there, her determination to get through it, and she never, I don't know, it's just very admirable. And I guess Netflix was trying to, or Prime or something, was trying to create a documentary, and her and Letitia both refused to be a part of it. Like, they really just want it to be behind them. They don't want to make money off of it. They don't want to glorize it. I think she wrote the book just so people would kind of leave her alone. She could just say, go read my book.
Right, yeah. And I mean, I think that's understandable. Every time you have to tell your story, it can be re-traumatizing.
So we are going to do our social media now, Courtney.
Yeah, so if you liked what you heard here on our episode, you can tell everybody all about it by commenting, by reviewing, rating, liking, subscribing, all of those fun things at any of our social media. So you can do that directly to us by emailing us at addictedtomurderpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram, which is Addicted to M Podcast, or you can find us on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and Twitter at Addicted to Murder Podcast.
See, even though I typed it out, I forgot something. Okay, well, thanks, Courtney. We do really need the likes, subscribes, and follows and all that. It just helps us stay motivated. Courtney, you're picking our next case.
Yes, and I've already done a lot of research about them, and he's pretty interesting. We are bringing it all the way back home to Eugene, Oregon.
Shut your lying mouth. Just
Nope.
kidding. You're not lying. I don't know why I said that.
Yeah. Technically, I suppose it's Springfield, Oregon.
Oh, well, that makes so much more sense.
Yes. But,
Just kidding.
It'll be an interesting one.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye.